Brindaji, the Justice Verma Committee recommendations actually seem to look at the issue of rape and sexual violence and sexual harassment in a much larger context. Really, it seems that it's looked at it in the context of gender justice and women's empowerment. Now, but at the same time, the ordinance that's been passed just yesterday, it seems that the ordinance has not only been passed in a hurry, but really, was there even a need for the ordinance, considering the government, considering the parliament, there is going to be a parliament session in the next fortnight. So, why really this tearing hurry to pass an ordinance?
I think that's an extremely relevant question to start off with, because indeed, why should they bring an ordinance? I believe that this ordinance has, why we really have to disapprove of it and oppose it is because I believe that 3 weeks before Parliament's going to have a sessions, you bring an ordinance which nothing really substantive in it. And therefore the whole procedure is questionable because it does go against democratic norms. Unless there's really a national emergency of some sort, you cannot approve the ordinance route. Whatever Parliament is, and you may have so many criticisms about Parliament, but just on the eve of a Parliament session, bringing an ordinance is highly undemocratic, and therefore I oppose it, firstly on those grounds. Secondly, not just on procedure, but also on substantive issues. It seems to me that this ordinance is really a dilution and a diversion from the context and the comprehensive nature of the Verma Committee recommendations.
Also, when you're saying that, exactly, when you're saying that it's a dilution and in some way a diversion from the comprehensiveness of the Verma Committee recommendations. So, what do you think are the important aspects of the Verma Committee recommendations that the ordinance is not looking into or has diluted?
See, first of all, what is this ordinance? Let's, get that out of the way. This ordinance actually dilutes some of Verma's recommendations. For example, the Verma Committee very clearly recommends that punishment for an officer guilty of dereliction of duty should go up to 5 years. This ordinance keeps it at 1 year. The Verma Committee recommends that victims of acid attacks must get compensation at least to cover medical expenses. The ordinance completely ignores that. The Verma Committee recommends that all the amendments to the Evidence Act, one after another, are comprehensive, one leading into the other. The ordinance literally is so highly selective that it undermines half of the recommendations. So, in fact, the ordinance itself dilutes recommendations on similar issues made by the Verma Committee. So, that's one aspect. The other is, of course, the Verma Committee looks at sexual violence in terms of an assault on women's sexual autonomy. That's very critical. Secondly, it looks at it in terms of a constitutional democratic violation. Therefore, the political aspects of it also are very clear. The question of power. So, the Verma Committee, I think, is 3 sections, to put it very briefly. One, the question of state culpability and the recommendations to address that. For example, public servants who are not doing their duty, command responsibility, bringing the armed forces into the criminal law. These are very critical in state culpability in crimes against women. That, of course, is completely ignored in the ordinance. The second aspect is, how do you look at violence in terms of the assertion or the rights of women's sexual autonomy? And there you have recommendations which are concerned with one, the choice of one's own partner, whether in terms of the Khap Panchayats or whether in terms of, alternative sexualities. And it also looks at sexual autonomy even within a marriage, because it says marriage is not a license to, violate a woman's bodily integrity. So the issue of consent is very, very critical to the understanding of sexual autonomy of women. And that is the core of the Verma Committee recommendations. I think government's having a lot of problems with accepting that or recognizing that.
Right, absolutely. And I mean, when you were talking about Khap Panchayats, and in fact, the Verma Committee recommendations has an entire chapter dedicated to Khap Panchayats and honor killings.
Which is very welcome.
Which is very welcome. But unfortunately, the ordinance, there seems to be no mention of that in the ordinance. And at the same time, in the past, we've heard the government saying that, we don't really need a separate law on honor killing. So what do you think is the attitude?
No, you see, actually, the ordinance comes in a background where the government has been completely exposed for its total callousness and criminal negligence in dealing with issues concerning sexual violence against women. It has been thoroughly exposed to them. And because of that, and also because it's also been exposed in the formation of the committee in what it hoped would just be a diversion from the big public outrage at that time. And they thought, this will divert public attention. We'll have a committee which won't complete its work within 1 month. And I mean, this is also proven by the fact that they didn't even provide the minimum infrastructure for the committee to work. The government's approach to the committee was really just to divert attention. And now that it has failed to do so, it now wants to use a committee recommendation to say, look, here we are, our intentions are so good, and we're so interested in quick justice that we're bringing this ordinance. And in fact, if you ask me, it's just lurching from one blunder in its handling of it to another, precisely because it doesn't have the political will to address this issue of sexual violence.
And that's perhaps why, even at one level that, some of the more difficult questions that were also raised in the Verma Committee recommendations about the misuse of AFSPA, for example,
absolutely
has been completely ignored in
that's the most critical part in state's culpability, the misuse of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. And the fact that Verma Committee has recommended a review of that, and that is why, what is a concrete amendment to that? The concrete amendment is 1, command responsibility, and 2, the recommendation to bring the armed forces where they are accused of sexual assault under the criminal law. Why should the armed forces have any protection from AFSPA? It's absolutely wrong, and we've been demanding this for decades. But one thing, if you look at the ordinance only as a political maneuver by the ruling UPA to get over its blunders and the way it has dealt with this and its lack of political responsibility in dealing with it, then it all falls into place. Therefore, an ordinance obviously not going to deal with the whole thing of Khap Panchayats. But government should say clearly, yes, we are committed to bringing a standalone law to deal with Khap Panchayats and honor crimes. Why are they not talking about honor crimes? There's not a single statement from the government. Caste politics.
Absolutely.
And vote bank politics, I think, is a much more concern to the government.
But at the same time, one sees certain recommendations of the Verma Committee that seem to have been looked at in the ordinance, where they're saying that the sexual history of the victim, of the rape victim, will become irrelevant to the investigations of the case. Do you see that as a step forward? And
you see, you can see sexual history in any case. It's now accepted law after the Mathura case that sexual history cannot be part of it. But that is not the critical point. The critical point there is Verma Committee's recommendations that consent has to be unambiguous consent by word or gesture. Now that is a concrete amendment. So once you have consent as the core of deciding whether it is consensual or coerced, the act of sex, then where's the question of sexual history and all that? Because if you can't prove consent, it doesn't matter. what the woman's sexual history is or anything else.
Absolutely.
But then you have to accept the Verma Committee's recommendation on consent. I mean, why didn't they bring that in the ordinance? Then we can understand if they do that. But
Absolutely.
वो तो नहीं किया ना.
But at the same time, there were some important, I know a lot has already been spoken about and written about the Verma Committee recommendations, but very briefly, at the same time, one was sort of also concerned about several important omissions in the Verma Committee report. What do you think those were?
I have written about that too, and I broadly put it into four things. One is this whole issue of caste and class power, which is used in the Indian context. And when you have the caste system, and when you have Dalit women in a situation where there are oppressions which are 3 times over because of her caste, because of her class, and because of the fact that she is very much part of a system where women are discriminated citizens. So you have gender, caste and class, and unless that is reflected in the law, therefore after a lot of struggle, women's organizations had got included a clause in the official amendment, criminal law amendment bill, which specifically talks about social, economic and political power.
Right.
And the misuse of that for rape, which will then come under the category of what we termed aggravated sexual assault. Now, for inexplicable reasons, because a Verma Committee report does talk about the caste system, it does talk about the particular dimensions of sexual violence on poor women, but why it is not recommended this extremely critical aspect of enhanced punishment when the perpetrator of the crime misuses his position or uses his position precisely to sexually assault a woman who's a Dalit or an Adivasi or a working class woman. It's unfair. I think it does injustice to the experience of a vast number of our women in India who are victims of sexual violence precisely because of their caste and class. The other aspect, and that again is linked to a perception of what a woman survivor of rape who belongs to either of these oppressed communities and caste or class require if they have to continue a struggle for justice is a rehabilitation approach and package. And this is not an academic thing. Some people mock it and say, "Arey, ye to rape ke compensation mang rahe hai." It's nothing like that. If I want to fight for justice, and if I lose my job, or if I lose my home, or if I don't have a home and I have to shift my home, or my girl is raped, and I have to protect her and I have to move away, who's going to pay for all that? Who's going to pay for my trips to the lawyer? Who's going to pay for my trips to the court?
And especially in the case of daily wage workers, women, there's for each trip to the court, they're losing that day's
Yes,
wage.
and we have a case, for example, in Haryana. In fact, all these 20 cases of a month, within 6 weeks in Haryana, they are all of either Dalit or working class women. And each and every one of them is finding it so hard to fight for justice because of real material conditions which are so weighted against her aspiration for justice. And why should we call it an aspiration? I mean her right for justice. So that's a big gap in the Verma Committee.
Brindaji, finally, I think the sense one got when we saw spontaneous protests in Delhi and in fact in other parts of the country, the sense one got was that perhaps this time there would be adequate pressure on the government to take the issue of gender justice more seriously. But it seems that again, in fact, the second chapter in the Verma Committee recommendations began by saying that the government cannot absolve its responsibility of protecting its citizens.
Yeah.
But by the look of things, when we look at the ordinance, one gets the feeling that that's pretty much what the government seems to be doing all over again.
And that's absolutely true. That's so true. It's once again just, been highly selective. And worse than that, they seem to have a concept that gender justice is equated with the death penalty for perpetrators of crime. I mean, you have death penalty on the statute books. As long as it's on the statute books, there is a category like rarest of the rare cases, and Justice Verma himself has clarified that where there is rape and murder, it would certainly come under the rarest of rare categories and could get the death penalty if the judges believe it to be so. But it's very much there on the statute book. But now if the government brings an ordinance just to address that issue and equates the entire question of gender justice with, this issue of the death penalty, I think it's, it's not only a gross injustice, but it also mocks the subversion of the process of law, which is resulting in a reality where rapists feel they have the license to rape because there is no certainty of punishment.
Absolutely.
I mean, out of 20,000 cases, you may not even get one case where the judges are going to say, give him the death penalty, even after this ordinance. But what happens to the 19,999 cases where there is no certainty of even a minimum punishment because you have not got the machinery or the political will to have a fair investigation to ensure the certainty of punishment?
In fact, both the Justice Verma recommendations and the ordinance don't seem to talk about judicial reforms or time-bound justice at all.
I mean, that is one of the big gaps, as we were saying, the speedy justice, which is one of the greatest demand, the most urgent demand, I would say. Fast-track courts and a 3-month, 3 months should be the time frame for a rape case. But Justice Verma doesn't talk about it. The government has taken advantage of that and therefore completely ignored it in its, so-called reaction in this ordinance. And therefore I feel, while we disapprove of this ordinance, I think it is very important to ensure that the Justice Verma Committee's recommendations do not meet the fate of other gender just legislations.
Absolutely.
And, that they're just brought out at the time of elections to show, look, we were committed and that's why we had this. But in actual fact, there's no political will to bring it to Parliament and to get it through. So I think those are the issues that we really are looking at right now.
Thank you so much, Brinda ji, for joining us.
Thank you.